Over the past century, a certain group of people have gone to excessive lengths to deny their involvement in the slave trade. According to several scholars, these select people have minimal involvement in slavery or the slave trade in general, and any suggestion otherwise should be considered hate speech. It has often been quoted that these people, if they had actually owned a slave, in practice treated their slaves better than their average white Christian counterparts. Moreover, several organizations have funded research specifically designed to justify this position, that if any Sephardim or Ashkenazim had participated in the institution of slavery, it was par for the colonial course. In the chapter, Judaism in the Antebellum South, Jason Silverman writes, quote, "For those Jews who did own slaves, the records demonstrate that they were not significantly different from other slave masters in their treatment of their bondsmen. Southern Jews were just as likely or unlikely to manumit their slaves, and if their last wills and testaments were indicative, Jews occasionally regarded their slaves as chattel to be retained if possible, or to be sold if the situation warranted. Incidents of cruel, sadistic, or violent Jewish slave owners are rare, in part because such episodes generally occurred in the rural South, where few Jews resided. A few Jews even became prominent slave-owning planters in the South. Judah P. Benjamin, master of the New Orleans plantation Belle Chase and its 140 slaves, was virtually an icon of the Southern gentleman and plantation owner. Major Raphael J. Moses owned a plantation with approximately 50 slaves near Columbus, Georgia. South Carolinians Nathan Nathans, Isaiah Moses, Mordecai Cohen, Isaac Lyons, Barrett Cohen, and Chapman Levy all maintained sizable slaveholdings, and various members of the Mordecai family owned Virginia and North Carolina plantations. Yet it must be remembered that as successful as these Jewish Southerners were by Southern standards, they represented a very tiny percentage of the 20,000 Jews residing in the antebellum South who could or would ever aspire to own a slave. About 5,000 Jews owned one or more slaves, about 1.25% of all the slave owners in the antebellum South. End quote. Judaism in the Antebellum South. Jason Jewishman. In this passage, Silverman concedes some level of participation by Jews within the slave trade, but injects a telling caveat into the nature of his purpose, while relating that a tiny percentage of Jews in the South owned a slave. He then goes on to say that only around 1.25% of all slave owners in the South were Jews. In the meantime, glazing over his presented statistic asserting that a quarter of Southern Jewry were slave owners. He uses the amount of total slave owners in the South to deflect from his statistical switcheroo. During this time in the antebellum South, Jews were less than 1% of the entire population. By some estimates, including Silverman's, 20,000 in the ambiguous South, which from 1815 to 1860 had an estimated population of over 4 million people, making this group a tiny percentage of the overall population to boot, around 0.5%. Yet, we're still 1.25% of slave owners in the South. Instead of using the more transparent statistic of 25% of Southern Jews owned slaves, He states only 1.25% of Southern slave owners were Jews, a blatant statistical conflation arranged in course to undersell the prior information. In 1931, 9 black teenagers were falsely accused of raping 2 white women in Alabama and were set to go to trial. According to David Levering Lewis, Du Bois and the NAACP thought it would be unadvantageous to support a cause for the defense of the Scottsboro boys. With the NAACP fumbling the ball, the Communist Party recovered the ball and drafted a Jewish Communist Dream legal defense team that included names like Joseph Brodsky, Irving Schwab, Samuel Leibowitz, Alan Taub, Joseph Tauber, Elias Schwartzbart, Carol Weiss, and Sidney Schreiber.
Holy Jewry!
Along with other Russo-Prussian surnames of a certain origin. The Scottsboro boys were eventually convicted of rape and sentenced to as much as 99 years in prison. However, most had been released on parole by the mid-1950s. As for the communist influence among indigenous Americans, there was a philosophical split emerging from the left, wherein the NAACP beforehand exemplified the impression of radicalism through their talented 10th ideology, which had no influence among working class Negroes. The Communist Party was looking to fill that void. With the willingness of the Communist Party to challenge the courts on behalf of working class Negroes, the Communist Party began siphoning off the more extreme left of the NAACP's support base. Now, all of a sudden, so-called Negroes were dropping the NAACP and flipping communist, essentially switching one set of Jews for the other, the Zionists for the communists. A two-headed eagle, or possibly a snake, intrinsically interconnected to one another. As stated earlier, communism created the conditions in Russia for Zionism and the creation of the 1948 nation of Palestinian occupation. The communists were something that the NAACP couldn't be, a white face. No matter how many white faces were behind NAACP decisions, they still had to remain black to the public. The communists had successfully pitted the NAACP against its own interests in its own corner of American philosophy. As stated by David Levering Lewis, the communist leadership used this opportunity to accuse Du Bois of being a class enemy and furthermore claimed the NAACP leadership was an isolated elite, disconnected from the blacks they ostensibly fought for. The communists, for their part, were already taking giant steps to garner community support when, as early as 1932, they accelerated James W. Ford as a vice presidential candidate for the Communist Party USA ticket. Ford had previously been a member of the Negro Labor Congress, a communist organization which targeted Southern blacks moving north during the Great Migration for membership, espousing representation and voter rights and labor conditions primarily. The Negro Labor Congress was founded by Lovett Whiteman, one of, if not the most notorious black communist of the early 20th century.
The document reads, Death Certificate, January 13, 1939. Levitt Fort Whiteman, American, convicted by Special Board of the NKVD of the USSR for anti-Soviet agitation.